welcome to the stage international broadcaster Zainab Badawi.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Zainab Badawi, since I'm in an Arabic-speaking country, and it's my great pleasure to be moderating this session with you. It's also wonderful to be enjoying the renowned, famous hospitality of the people of Saudi Arabia, not only enjoying the fruits of their hospitality, but also the fruits of our impending discussion. Now, we're going to be talking about the new Africa, expanding business opportunities. And I'm going to just very quickly quote Donald Trump. Yes, I said Donald Trump. When in September last month at the United Nations General Assembly, when he was talking with the African heads of state, he went off script for a moment and everybody got very, very worried. But then he said, oh yes, Africa's open for business. It's terrific. I've got some of my best friends. They just want to rush into the continent to make money. And the African leaders looked and then thought, actually, you know what? That's a good little ad-lib he made there, because it will correct misperceptions in their view of the continent as being somewhere where you don't invest. And if you look at the data, actually, and you take out the poor-performing countries in North Africa and the faltering economies of South Africa and Nigeria, actually, the growth story is not bad at all in Africa, and there are some real star performers like Ivory Coast, Tanzania, Rwanda, Ethiopia. So that's what we're going to be exploring today. Can Africa diversify, get away from the rent-seeking model whereby 40 of 54 African countries we know depend on one commodity usually, often oil, for example, or minerals? Can they diversify, use their commodities as a way of leveraging capital to build a more inclusive, sustainable future for their people? So I've got some panel, please do come on. I've got a wonderful panel of people who are working on the continent and investing in the continent, who are going to be sharing their insights with you about where they think the opportunities lie, where the barriers are, and what can be done to overcome them. And while they're taking their seats, hello panel, very nice to see you all. Would you be so kind as to answer the question that you can take out your mobile phone, get the Investment Forum app, and see if you can answer these questions for us as to what the priority should be. So they're all important factors, as you can see, for accelerating economic growth on the continent. But what do you think is the most important? 1, infrastructure. 2, regional integration. 3, access to technology. 4, workforce and skills training. 5, education. Okay, so just take a moment to gather your thoughts and see what you think. And then I'm going to poll you again at the end, and we'll see if opinions have shifted in the light of what our panel have been saying. So, Catherine Tweedy, you are Executive Director of Investec, and is my microphone gone? Can you hear me? I think my microphone might have gone a bit.
Maybe
can I just give you the results? Sorry, I can't see this from there. So infrastructure is by far and away the lead answer. 42.9%, nearly 43%. Regional integration, surprisingly, 0. Access to technology, 0. Workforce and skills training, 28.6. This is like the Rosetta Stone, trying to see this from here. And number 5, education, is 28.6. So workforce and skills training, education tie on nearly 30%, but by far the biggest winner is 42.9, 43%. So let's see what they have to say at the end. Catherine Tweedy, you are Executive Director of Investec. You're based in New York, but also you are somebody who is South African, so you know the continent very well. So when we're looking at this question of diversification, where do you stand? Do you think that there are real growth opportunities, and in which sectors and in which countries?
Great. Well, thanks, Zainab, and lovely to be here today. I work with Investec Asset Management, and we do have the benefit of perspective. We're a South African firm. We've been investing across the continent for more than 26 years. We currently have more than $35 billion of capital invested across the capital structure in Africa. So sort of putting today, I know there's been some real question marks around the outlook for Africa. I would say our current perspective is we're more cautious, but cautiously optimistic. And some of the things that we think are driving the opportunity are particularly in the areas of household spending, urbanization, and demographics. So, just a few stats to get us started. McKinsey thinks that household consumer spending totaled 1.4 trillion in 2015, but estimates are that they're going to grow by a total of 645 billion between now and 2025, up to 2.6 trillion per annum, largely led by East Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and crossing basic food items, food, beverage, as well as with increase in discretionary income, financial services, recreation, housing, and healthcare. So largely driven by growing population, a young aspiring population, rising incomes, and largely an urban story. So why are we excited about this? When you look at some of our recent investments, they're taking place in traditional economies that have been centered around commodities. We announced a deal actually yesterday. It's the largest buyout transaction in Botswana with a company called Komoso. Now, Komoso is a leading manufacturer and supplier of consumer goods and healthcare, as well as do-it-yourself products. And we're very excited about this transaction. And as a buyout, we're buying into this company because we see them as a regional champion, producing locally. They know their distribution networks throughout Southern Africa. And we've bought them because we believe in the future growth. Another quick example, just quickly, is Nigeria. We've invested in Darajio Industries, which is a local producer of toothpaste, soap, detergent. They're giving a lot of the multinationals a good run for their money because they know their market. We see a lot of opportunity coming through Africa while being selective about the countries and the places where we do business.
Okay. Thank you. Bob Diamond, chairman and co-founder of Atlas Mara, and of course you've had a stellar career in all sorts of financial institutions in the past, Barclays, Credit Suisse, Morgan Stanley, is it, or JP Morgan, one or the other. And you have really backed Africa very much by setting up this investment fund to try and put capital in certain sectors in the economy. We just wanted to talk to you about capital because often people do say on the continent that capital doesn't go to the right sectors sometimes, and that big money is often looking for big projects, and there aren't always the big projects there. And we know that most entrepreneurs in Africa are the SMEs, and that they are the ones who are just crying out for, access to capital, loans, and so on. They don't get it from their own domestic market, and they're not getting it from the international market as well. So in order to grow and seize opportunities, you need the capital. So perhaps just give us your overview on where we are on that.
So my background is financial, so of course we're investing in financials, but I'd rather put it in a different perspective, which is if one believes with the macro story of the very, very incredible demographics, the urbanization, the ability to leapfrog with technology, and I'm not going to go through all those, we know the story. If you believe that at all, you have to believe that financial services will lead. And I think without a serious investment in financial services, the chances of economic growth and job creation are really, really diminished. If you think about the traditional model of a domestic bank, whether it's in Botswana or Zambia or Nigeria, they tend to take deposits and then they invest in domestic treasury bills at 11, 12, 13, 14, 15%. That's great for returns, but it's not good for getting lending to consumers and lending to small businesses. So our focus on financial services is very much disruptive. We want to find ways to get lending to consumers and lending to small businesses. The other thing that's happened over the last 3 to 4 years is that the larger international banks, my former bank Barclays is a good example, have been exiting. One of the consequences of the financial crisis is capital charges no longer provide capital synergies to global banks operating in Africa. So we have a situation where the domestic model is not benefiting job creation, economic growth, and the European banks, because of capital charges from SIFI and G-SIFI, are pulling capital back to domestic markets. The global banks are doing less business. The need for African-based banks is incredible, and our vision is to acquire banks in 10 to 15 key countries and over time integrate those on one platform that can provide the kinds of tools we all know banks have. Capital market platforms, how to help farmers hedge the crop for next year. All these tools are not particularly creative or innovative, they're just creative and innovative because of the model in Africa. So we think that the opportunity to invest in financials is absolutely phenomenal. From a funding point of view, a fund doesn't work in this case. If you go to a regulator and say, we're going to buy 100% of a bank, and you have LPs that need their money back in 3, 4, 5, or 6 years, it's not going to work. And I think one of the innovations that we have been bringing is the idea of having permanent capital. It's really necessary in a highly regulated sector of the economy, such as banking, not necessarily every sector, but we found an ability to raise permanent equity for Africa is probably more available than we would have thought.
Just very, very quickly before I move on, I mean, private equity is used to taking high risks, but not in unstable markets. And so, because we know capital is a coward, and it worries about some of the lack of consistency and stability that you see in many African countries. So how much of a barrier do you think that is?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that I said it's 10 to 15 key countries. And our investors know that we have a specific set of countries where the rule of law is appropriate, the size of the market is appropriate, the financial services opportunity is appropriate. And in some cases, Ethiopia is a great opportunity, but right now the regulators do not allow foreign capital to invest in banks, so that wouldn't be naturally on the list. But places like Nigeria, Rwanda, Botswana are very receptive.
Well, they've got very much a kind of state capitalism model, haven't they, in Ethiopia, I suppose, which is a little bit more rigid. Thank you. Adewale, known as Wale Tinubu, you are Chief Executive of WANDO, which is an indigenous energy solutions outfit, and you come from Nigeria. Just picking up on what Bob was just saying there, I mean, you know, markets and capitalists need stability, and they need to know that there is a regulatory and fiscal framework that is going to survive, even if politics changes. The policies have got to remain the same, and that arguably that is one of the biggest barriers to getting investment into Africa, because people just investors don't have the confidence, which is why we know that global FDI is very low in Africa, just over 2%. So as somebody who knows what's going on the continent with, you know, business leaders and also political leaders, what are you doing at your end in order to facilitate a greater exploitation of Africa's economic potential?
I think first things first, the macro situation, first and foremost, needs to be a priority for people to invest. And there's no doubt that the continent has incredible opportunities, but people have been scared in the past because the public sector has tended to be weak. I mean, democracy is recent. I mean, let's face facts. The continent is democratizing across the board. Institutions have been weak in the past, so there's now a big emphasis on rule of law. The African Union is stronger. There's more regional integration via the regional bodies like ECOWAS, COMESA in the south. And I think that the rule of law is something which we are all improving on, not because it's fashionable to do it, but it's simply just a way to ensure that international investors see the stability they require in terms of institutions. So in Nigeria, for example, we've had a very, very strong emphasis on ensuring that the court systems function, There's appropriate titles being given for land and investments, and people do have certainty of investment. So Bob wouldn't be in Nigeria considering an investment in a bank, okay, if he didn't believe that the regulatory system was strong enough to withstand pressure when disputes arise. In terms of investments as a whole, I think that we are getting to a position now that the flows are coming in, and we are seeing tremendous investments across the sector in fast-moving commodities, manufacturing, agriculture in particular. And what we do need to now do is to ensure that we deal with the soft issues, which is ensure that ease of business is a priority. People need to be able to come into a country, open a bank account, get their business registered, commence operations. We need to have tariffs that make sense. For example, regional integration is extremely poor within the continent.
Were you surprised that it had such a low take-up?
I am quite
0%, because
yes.
it's a huge priority, isn't it, for African leaders?
It is, because at the end of the day, we end up producing what we don't need and exporting what we need. I mean, let's take Nigeria as an example. We export 70% of our gas, and we have something like a 40% electricity penetration within the country. We export 2 million barrels a day of crude, yet we import 1 billion tons a month of refined petroleum products. So there's a mismatch. And the mismatch primarily exists because of policies that are self-inflicted, I'd say. I mean, a simple example is to encourage foreign investment, just like we're talking about the environment, you need an economy that is deregulated. People need to know we can bring in our capital, invest, we can sell at the market price, and export our capital as and when. It has to be free entry of capital and free exit of capital. And these are the soft issues which we do need to tackle, which we are doing a relatively good job of. If not, there wouldn't be this African renaissance, economic renaissance, which we're experiencing today.
You mentioned the fact that obviously Nigeria, a key oil producer, and yet it has to import its petrol, although it's a huge crude oil producer. But there is investment going on in the country to try to correct that. So we have the richest man in Africa, Aliko Dangote, who is building a refinery in Nigeria. But perhaps you just give us a very quick answer as an overview as how that is going, because of course he's having to deal with the double whammy of a depreciation. I didn't say an active devaluation of the naira by the government, but there's a depreciation in the naira and also obviously relatively low oil prices. But that is one very, very clear example of investment to try to get away from this ridiculous situation.
I think we tell the truth in Africa now, so I would say it's a devaluation, not a depreciation. We tell the truth to ourselves now.
The government say depreciation, but there we go, yeah.
And that's why we at least face up to the issues. I think that as a nation, we enjoyed the benefit of very, very high crude oil prices for a while. And in that time frame, rather than invest or save as much as we should have saved and focus on infrastructure, we focused on financing consumption. So we had subsidies, petrol subsidies. And in the process, the infrastructure decayed, the refineries couldn't keep up with the consumption. And we're growing, close to 5% per annum in population. So we had a situation where the demand continued to rise substantially, and it affected our capacity to deliver. So it brings me to the next question. One of the key models that Nigeria has picked up on is public-private sector partnership.
Yeah.
And indeed, Aliko's refinery is a simple example of that nature, in the sense that the crude is going to come from the government. You have to take the risk on the capital to build the refinery, and the demand exists. On our side as a business, we took on the task of distributing gas to industries in Nigeria, and we built a public sector private model where we wrote the rules together with the government, educated them, created a governance structure, created a structural policy for the government, hand in hand with them, and we rolled out a gas pipeline system within Lagos where we serve 60% of the industrial capacity, and we've done the same thing in 3 other cities. And that's proven to be a very good model.
That's a very good model, isn't it? The public-private partnership way of funding new opportunities is very important. And often there is a third arm, isn't there? Sometimes you see a development agency also coming in as the third partner. Thank you. Shiv Khemka, you are Vice Chairman of Sun Group, which is a a company based in India but does investments also in West Africa and in Nigeria also. So talking about energy and power, this is a very, very critical industry, obviously, and we know that African leaders, African business leaders as well, are now just saying you can't do anything in Africa unless you have proper power and energy, because we know there's a huge energy deficit and power deficit for people on the continent. So just give us an idea of what your entity is doing in terms of investments in this area in West Africa.
Sure, thank you, Zainab. We're a family business from India. Started working in Africa 10 years ago, so we're new to Africa. We decided to, we chose Nigeria as a place to work because of the oil and gas abundance in the country. And we chose a very good local partner. And it's taken us 10 years to get to production, exploration and production. It's not been easy, but at the end of the day, I think it's a part of the world with tremendous opportunity. And so we remain excited, enthusiastic. We find the human capital to be very high quality. We find the politics to sometimes get in the way, stumbling over itself. But at the end of the day, I couldn't agree more with Wally that when you look at it objectively, it doesn't make any sense. A country with the type of gas reserves that it has, to have production less than a city in Delhi, a per capita consumption of power in Nigeria is 3% of what it is in South Africa, 5% of what it is in China, 20% or a bit more, 22% of what it is in India, in a country which has one of the world's largest gas reserves. So that doesn't make any sense. There's now a privatization of the power sector that's going on. I think that's a great sign. Distributed power, sustainable models, renewable power. I think all these things are going to change, are going to create energy and momentum. When we look at Africa, we really think it's slightly padlocked by 2 or 3 things. The first is infrastructure. It needs the infrastructure to be in place. And governments really should make a big effort working with the private sector to come up with models to create infrastructure. Obviously, the Chinese have done it best. India is doing reasonably well now with public-private models. And I think Africa now needs to do more and more in that area. Transportation infrastructure, for example, we find problematic in Nigeria as an example. Again, more can be done there. Second thing I think is human capital. A lot more can be done on training, skilling, education, globalization of that education capability. And I think then really once you unlock those 2 things, I think you'll have tremendous opportunities in Nigeria and in other parts of Africa.
It's interesting that you raise the issue of the workforce, because we know that, I think there's going to be 450 million more workers in Africa joining the labour force in under 20 years. And, by the start of the 22nd century, Africans will form close on 1/3 of the global population, because obviously the population is shrinking, but Africa's one is expanding very, very quickly. So would you say it's very, very wise for people to, appreciate the demographics of what's going on and to say, look, if you want to thrive as a business in the medium and the long term, you're going to have to look at Africa. We heard Catherine Tweedy talking about consumers, African consumers, and also Africa labour force and using technology, which Bob mentioned. So do you think all the ingredients really are there and shouldn't be ignored?
So coming from India, 1.3 billion people, adding 25 million people a year, needing to create 1.3 million jobs a month to sustain our growth. When I look at Africa, I see very similar issues. How do you educate at scale? How do you create the skilling required as we look at the 4th industrial revolution, as we look at all the new technologies that are coming in? This conference is all about the future, and yesterday the Crown Prince spoke very eloquently about the future and the vision of the future, where jobs we know of today will cease to exist, new jobs will be created. So I think it's a huge challenge, actually. I think Africa, like India, has a demographic dividend, potentially, because we have young populations, but it's all about what we do with those populations. Are we able to actually create that raw material into productive labor forces, workforces, create the jobs, in India or in Africa and globally, or do we actually destroy that human capital and create a demographic time bomb instead? So I think that's a real challenge for governments.
Song Dongsheng, you are president of Power China International. You're also vice chairman of Sino Hydro, which is in the name, about hydro power. And I said at the outset that Africa doesn't attract a great deal of global FDI, but it does obviously have a lot of investment from China. And in fact, that's what the figures show, that Africa's getting a lot of investment from developing countries, India, emerging nations, China, and so on and so forth, not from the OECD countries. So you are very interested in hydropower. And we know that Africa only uses about 10% of its potential for hydropower. So just tell us a bit about the kind of investments that you are doing in that area on the continent. Just lift up your microphone towards you.
Yes, as you said, I'm president of Power China International and chairman of Sino Hydro. So our business does not only include hydro. Our business covers all power, including nuclear power, and all infrastructure. So in last about 15 years, we completed so many big hydropower, more than 20 big hydropower projects in Africa continental, including we are doing a big hydro Zangiro in Nigeria. So yes, infrastructure is a top priority. Power, electricity is a priority of priority. So we believe to develop more power is very sensitive for the economy of Africa. Now, China and Chinese companies, including Power China, Sino Hydro, we change our strategy. Like Power China, Sino Hydro, before we were a traditional contractor. Now we change ourselves into a developer and investor. So Power China, Sino Hydro we start invest the power plant in Zimbabwe this month. So it's 700 megawatts. We invested it. So we are negotiating many power plants, IPP, PPP. So there's a huge potential. Now it's only 30% of population access to power in sub-Saharan countries. So why now is such a small figure? I think companies from China, from India, from US, from other countries. The first, I think we need to try to know Africa. And now there are so many misunderstandings about America. Many people, many companies, they believe Africa is still full of corruption, arrest, or whatever. So I believe this is a kind of misunderstanding. So the first step is we try to understand Africa. Second, we try to love Africa. So we can do a lot. So we can do a lot of contribution to the growth of Africa countries.
Can I ask you that there are a lot of Africans who have really welcomed the agreement that was signed last month between China and Guinea-Conakry, because of course we know Guinea is one of the world's biggest producers of bauxite, which is how you make aluminium, and they've, said to themselves, we want to know where the value chain is, because at the moment their bauxite goes to Iceland, all the way to Iceland to be processed into aluminium. So they made a deal with China whereby they would get $20 billion over 20 years, and they would pay China with bauxite. And that the Chinese have said, we know prices fluctuate, but we will guarantee a certain price for you. And the Guineans are using that money to invest in infrastructure, including the kind of plants that will allow them to process the bauxite into aluminium. So do you see that as a good model of how Africans can leverage their commodities in order to invest?
Power China Sina Hydro is working in Guinea also, and I believe that could be one of solutions. So actually, Sina Hydro, together with other Chinese companies, we did a big copper mine project in DRC. We are investor. So when we do this copper mine business, we arrange additional billions of dollars for DRC's infrastructure. I believe use potential natural resources to exchange finance for infrastructure could be a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll just open this up now since everybody's made their introductory remarks. Clearly, diversification and moving away from just reliance on, single commodities and added value is the kind of message that we're getting from African business leaders as well as political leaders. How far do you think the business community is aware of the potential of, what is going on in the continent?
Well, let me just come back to some of the things that Wally was saying about Nigeria. We tend to think about the oil sector, the dominance of the economy. It was a very, very large percentage, particularly of foreign currencies. But the largest sector of the economy in Nigeria is actually agriculture. And you have 60 to 70% of the people working in agriculture and 20% of the output. And to your point on aluminium, if we can find ways to invest in agriculture, and this number just stuns me all the time, but if you look at the World Economic Forum data, the world's going to run out of food. But 60% of the non-farmed arable land in the world is in sub-Saharan Africa. The opportunity in agriculture, and this is where it brings it back to financial services and banks. If you are a farmer and you can't get long-term funding, you're going to do crop to crop. You're going to be selling your commodity to someone else who's actually producing the final products. Rwanda has figured this out earlier on with coffee as an example, and is a big exporter of the final product. But if we can untap the technology, the financing, if we can help farmers hedge out the price of the commodities that they're growing for 2 or 3 or 4 years and get term financing. You do that with public-private partnership where maybe some of the credit protection is provided by the government. The opportunity for agriculture, which is already the largest sector in Nigeria, the most dynamic economy.
It is, but unfortunately, as you know, you're right, it employs something like 70 to 80% of the workforce, but it accounts for 6% of GDP. Right. And that shows you immediately that something...
Opportunity.
Opportunity, but also that something is not right going on there. So let me put that to you then, Catherine. Bob brings up the issue of farmers, and we know that the Nigerian government is on a drive to make, farming the new oil, as it were, to, have farming millionaires and so on, to make it very attractive. And that, it's working to some extent, but how do you develop agriculture from a business point of view? Do you go for the big bang, the boom, or do you focus on the smallholder, which is, of course, the one that dominates the sector in Nigeria?
I think one of the big issues is something that Bob raised, in that, when you look over the last few years, there's been a significant amount of capital that's been raised for big projects, and then sort of a lot of visibility on the need for microfinance. But many of our sort of small to medium companies are growing faster than many of their peers in the rest of the world, particularly in emerging markets. But we lag behind other emerging markets in terms of our ability to transform small companies into large ones. I don't think we have any African companies at the moment in the global Fortune 500. And this is back to your point. I think banks have been very lazy. I think they've been risk averse, and you don't have the capital that is required to go into the growth side of things. And I'll give you an example. We've invested in a fantastic company called Mobisol, working to provide off-grid energy in Tanzania, Rwanda, etc. You know, they come in, they put the solar on the roof. They then have very innovative mobile payments technology. And essentially they're creating, through these, you know, small homes and businesses getting access to power, they're creating their own sort of payment profile per person. Anyway, we want to go and expand and build out this business and create a receivables business. So we go to a number of banks. We cannot get receivables financing for this business. It's a great idea. It's well executed. It's supporting grassroots entrepreneurs. It's sponsored. Have you tried Atlas Mara? It's sponsored by, you know, it's German technology, and we just see this real sort of lack of, in a way, lack of entrepreneurship for companies that are actually doing very well.
So, and there are so many entrepreneurs in Africa.
So what are we doing?
The entrepreneurial spirit.
We as a on our private equity business, we're sponsoring that component, which shouldn't be in private capital. So I really think that there's a great opportunity for well-structured, emerging growth businesses. We just need some more creativity on the private capital that is coming into Africa and working with banks that are thinking about the opportunity in a different way, and not just in, you know, taking deposits in and taking their 8 or 9% and you know, maybe doing a bit of trade funding. So I think
I just want to ask you very quickly, Catherine, in terms of capital that's available. I mean, people often point at a very stark figure, which is Africa gets $61 billion a year in remittances. And if you compare that, for example, to overseas development assistance aid, ODA, which is 50 billion, and that people are beginning to wonder if you can leverage remittance funds as a way of investing in agriculture or whatever. I mean, do you think that's another way of getting? It is, but I wouldn't. It's not the way that I would think of fund. I think there are many other ways. You shouldn't necessarily just look to to remittances to be your transformative form of capital. And I'd also just make one other very quick point. You'd said that a lot of the funding that's coming into Africa is coming from other emerging markets. Well, actually, there are a lot of developed countries that are looking at Africa. We're running a $1 billion fund on behalf of the UK government and a number of Nordics, focusing on development, early stage development infrastructure financing. And we're having a lot of success in small power plants and other things. So it's the increase in FDI is from non-OECD countries. It's not that the OECD countries are not investing, but there is actually an increase in FDI. We need more creativity. The opportunities there. Yes, Bob. Did you want to
just jump in for a second? We just completed 200 million permanent equity capital raise. Over 90% of it came from North America. So I think there is money that is willing, it wasn't taken out of other emerging markets. It's coming from the US and Canada, and it's looking to be invested in operating companies and real businesses.
Well, that's good news that Bob's raising permanent capital, because one of the things I found in building our group was that there's just an evident lack of equity within the African market. So there's a lot of reliance on debt, but average interest rates in Nigeria, for example, are 22% per annum. So to actually achieve a return on equity is almost, or return on capital in general is challenging if your business is debt-based. But that's really what's available. So even when we built pipeline systems in the country, we had a series of overdrafts, 2-year financings, which will keep rolling over every 24 months until we were able to achieve a $100 million or $150 million project. But it didn't stop us building out a group, okay? And we were able to take the limited sources of capital available to us and then use that to develop the infrastructure that is required. And that infrastructure is critical. So the point was made regarding what Guinea is doing, regarding deals with the Chinese. And all that's simply happening is that the reserve base of the country, albeit mineral wealth, is now being put into a structure that enables capital to be raised, and that capital is now coming in form of development. So that's a business model that's certainly evolving in the continent, where we're taking the resources we have, creating debt notes against those resources, which tend to be distributed across the world, and that development occurs. So even in agriculture, our Sovereign Wealth Fund has been very active in creating a support-based system to finance the back end that will make agricultural revolution work. So, for example, fertilizer distribution and fertilizer production.
But banks still in Nigeria lend very little to agriculture. It's something like 5% of their lending goes to farming.
Yes, but the real truth about the matter is that I don't know whether the challenge really is to seek bank financing for these things. Bank financing is driven entirely by what the macro and micro requirements of the country. So Nigeria, for example, the federal government of Nigeria is the biggest borrower. It borrows 70% of the deposits. You get a tax-free rate on your treasury bill if you buy their treasuries. So the banks don't really have an incentive to lend to the private sector. So the private sector is crowded out. And what is required is an equity base. And I think this is why forums of this nature are good, because there are wonderful opportunities within the country. And indeed, it takes a leap of faith to accept that that old narrative of Africa being a dark continent with poor institutions, poor rule of law, risk of investments is actually something of the past. It's only 3% of global GDP, yet it will, like we've all discussed regarding the statistics, it will account for something like 30 to 40% of global increase in population. Nigeria by 2050 will be the third largest country from a population base after China and India. And there's going to be 70 to 100 million jobs that are required over a 2-year period in the country as a result of the rapid population increase. And majority of it is going to come from small to medium sector. Agriculture is going to be very, very important because at least you put people to work. And what's been going on is the government has now focused entirely on providing funding for farmers, okay, via a series of schemes. It's also focusing on building out the infrastructure in a thoughtful manner. We're fixing the roads that take products from the farms to the market, and also focusing on the export of that product. So there is a two-way contribution that needs to be done. There will be public sector intervention, but clearly the private sector, both local and international, does need to step in.
Needs to step in. But really underscoring what you're talking about when we talked about how African countries can use commodities to leverage, capital in the way that we gave the example of Guinea and China, really underscoring what you're saying is the value added. So, yes, you can increase agriculture in Nigeria through investments and, great effort from policymakers, but there's no point. I mean, I always love the story of Nigeria is one of the biggest producers of tomatoes and yet is one of the biggest importers of canned tomatoes. There are countless examples like that all over Africa. So value added is very important. And that is another area, a growth area for investors, because we know Africa's value added is very low, about, I think, 8% on average. So, for example, the biggest cocoa producers in the world, Ivory Coast and Ghana, they have, the value added is about 8%, which is equivalent to the marketing budget of Suchards, the chocolate makers. So you need the value added, and there is a great potential there for investors.
There is a beneficiation of raw materials is critical going forward, but the good news is that it's a man-made problem. I mean, when you have an abundance of a raw material and you end up exporting that raw material and importing the finished goods, then there's something that can be fixed, because the biggest challenge is having the raw material in the first place. So if we take something like manufacturing in Africa, take a simple example like Nigeria, the point was made regarding the shortfall in power. Now, the shortfall in power was created by the fact that we're entirely dependent on the government to provide power for the citizenry. And that was a model which worked in the 40s and the 50s, and the 30s and the 60s. But the issue is that nobody expected the population increase to be so rapid. And at the end of the day, you have to create other models to bridge that gap. And that's where the private sector initiative was. We were late in accepting that you needed to tap capital from the world to develop your own local power industry. And it required a reform. And that reform required, for us to deregulate the source of the power. But of course, politicians want to stay in office, so they don't want to raise bills. So when they don't raise tariffs, invariably what happens in the country is that we have a dearth of investment. And it postpones it. You win today's election, but the people suffer 8 years down the line. So we did do a reform, and we are approaching a market which will be fully deregulated. Then the distribution companies were privatized by government, and they were allowed to get on. Government retained the stake, and then the power sector, okay, was allowed to. Foreign investment was allowed, and foreign investment has started, but it's a wonderful opportunity for the country because, but it's not enough, and the key to that has been in the government providing some kind of institutional support, and that's occurred by creating a bulk trader, which effectively acts as a clearinghouse to ensure that people who produce electricity and they can manage the shortfall between collection from the public and payment back to the foreign investor, and that's working very well.
Just conscious of time, sorry, yes. Shiv, Wale mentioned manufacturing, but actually people often use manufacturing interchangeably with industrialization. And we know that one of Africa's objectives is to industrialize, which is something quite different. It also means, you know, an efficient and developed service sector. And I know obviously in India, the service sector is huge. And actually in Africa, it's, I think, 48% of GDP. So, you know, industrialization, including the service sector, is also another huge area.
I completely agree. I think, you know, the IT revolution helped India to rethink of itself in a different way. You know, India today exports, you know, $120 billion of IT services around the world. And although it only employs 10 or 15 million people, it creates a self-image of the country that it can be a service leader, which drives education, which drives aspirations for young people, etc. I think similarly in Africa, and we keep talking about Africa, you know, 54 countries, very different issues, challenges. But if we talk about it as a whole, I think the issue of human capital and the infrastructure, not only the physical infrastructure, but the infrastructure for education is critical. And infrastructure for skilling, infrastructure for entrepreneurship, the laws, the enabling architecture that allows people to be entrepreneurs, the funding mechanisms that allow people to start small businesses and do well, and women and girls, the whole issue of, you know, bringing them into the economy in a fully productive manner. I think these are the real challenges, and they're very similar challenges actually to what we have in India. So I think we can learn a lot. I think China has done a tremendous amount, and we've learned as India from China a lot of the amazing things they've done. I think China's done a lot in Africa. It's been great to see all the things they've done there. And I think, you know, in India we've done a lot of things that one could learn from as well. And I think in Africa now, you're starting to see the green shoots of a lot of these ideas. I know Tony Elumelu's foundation is doing a lot of work in entrepreneurship, for example. A lot of wonderful things are happening. The question is, it should happen systemically across different countries, and so people don't get left behind. And the dream of Africa really becomes a dream that we can all look forward to, rather than a crisis.
I was going to give you a chance to do a closing statement. You know, you've just done your closing statement there, but I'll ask Mr. Song. So, as I said, the service sector is very important. I mean, I think the figures in Nigeria are quite striking. We're talking about agriculture is 6% of GDP, but the creative industry, Nollywood, is about 5% of GDP. So, how far is China investing in the service sector and the creative industries in Africa?
There's only final 2 minutes. As a service, as a business, I want to change this topic into another. I think Africa, they need consultant service. So international organizations, international banks, big international companies, they should give consultancy service to Africa government to create different business models for different projects. So if we can have different models there, bankable models there. So I think so many investors, they would like to come to Africa. So that's my suggestion.
So what's your message, 30 seconds, all of you, to all the investors here? Come and do business in Africa. Thumbs up. Catherine.
I would say come and be selective, have a long-term mindset, and look for the right partners.
Bob?
I think there's an opportunity to invest where you know that people are on the ground operating. The single biggest opportunity to me is trade. less than, you know this, less than 20% of the trade in Africa is intra-Africa. And President Kagame and the East Africa community, things going on in the SADC community, the opportunity to drive regional trade by breaking down the barriers of labor mobility, capital mobility, just simple things like transport across border. The upside to this in trade is phenomenal. Great opportunity to invest right now.
Great. I'll go to you, Shiv.
I would say definitely we're in Africa. We're spending more and more time and energy to do more in Africa. And I agree with what Catherine and Bob said. I just, again, repeat, long-term view is very important. Partners are very important, who one works with. And finally, the human capital that one has to really select well and train well and develop it further.
Mr. Song, well, we know China invests in Africa. What's your message?
So Africa has a very bright future. I strongly believe, please come to our Africa. Love our Africa. Thank you.
And last word to the person from the most populous nation in Africa, 180 million and still counting.
Well, I think Africa is open for business, and there's an emergence of local entrepreneurs, very successful, knowledgeable local entrepreneurs. And you can use them with the appropriate partnerships to navigate the opportunities that truly exist. And I think that also, if you're not in Nigeria, you're not in Africa, so please start with Nigeria.
You would say that. So just if you could take your phones again and just vote on the questions I asked you at the beginning. So what are the priorities that you believe? They're all important, we know, but what's the most important for accelerating growth? Infrastructure, 1, 2, regional integration. You heard Bob Diamond mention that, regional trade. 3, access to technology. 4, workforce and skills training. 5, education. So if you could please vote. Infrastructure the same, same results. So you didn't sway any opinions here, panel, but I thank you anyway for your contribution, all of you, and thank you also for your attention. I hope you have a good afternoon. Thank you.